if there was anything that didn't go together in the minds of many people, especially those that we are constantly in touch with on a daily basis, it would be the two things that are connected in the song we just sang. Singing and being a pilgrim. If there ever was something that would not place you in the position of being happy, cheerful, and in a singing type mood, it would be the realization that you have no permanent dwelling. That you're traveling from hither to yon, trying to find a place for your cattle to eat, only to have them eat all the grass that's there and have to travel on, as was the case with all of the patriarchs of old, as they were described by Joseph to his brethren in our devotional reading. They were shepherds. Shepherds being right there along the line of the counterpart in the New Testament, I guess, would be fishermen. Is there anything lower than a fisherman? Well, only a shepherd. Is there anything lower than a shepherd? Well, only a fisherman. And yet, it's those two humble, and of course, hopefully you realize that I'm, with my tongue in cheek, I'm talking about worse, lowly, and all that regarding those two occupations, those two characteristics. Isn't it amazing that God would take individuals who had those lowly positions, those meager jobs, and take the gospel to a world through their efforts? Which, of course, would lend itself to the idea then that people could not say, oh, it was because those guys went to university over here, because they ain't going to no university. Oh, it's because they sat in the seats of some of the greatest philosophers that had ever lived, and they learned all the wisdom of the world. They didn't sit in no philosopher's classroom, except Paul, who would be sitting at the feet of Gamaliel and learning much about the culture and the education that a Jew could receive in the city of Jerusalem. But from that humble beginning, and from the humble beginning of a nation of people developed over time, that God is going to bring the Messiah through, and that being the beginning instances of that taking place and being carried out in the last chapters of the book of Genesis. Now we're going to come back to this section of Scripture because it makes a significant point later on. But we're going to continue on because you may not have realized it, but this morning's sermon was the introduction. And this is the rest of the sermon. We're talking about consequences. And when we're talking about consequences, we're talking about that which is the result of something. As a matter of fact, it could very well be looked at it in the position of a cause and effect. We're talking about that which cost, or something that which is the penalty to be paid because of the direct result of you doing this, that, or the other. And it can be in a positive type of way, and it can be in a negative type of way. It's just according to what it is consequence from. We begin to look at and lay a little bit of a foundation from the Scriptures relative to a law that we're all aware exists, but we probably never called it a law. We all will admit, at least in private, that there is such a law that does exist, but then sometimes we go through life acting as if, well, no, it really doesn't after all. And you'll know what I mean as we delve deeper into this subject. The law of unintended consequences. And by that, of course, we mean the consequences that result that we were not planning on, that we could not have supposed. We never would have thought that letting our 16-year-old child borrow the car for the first time would end up sticking over the guardrail and a little bit above the ground. And maybe it can be salvaged except for a little bit of body work. But could that not very well be a picture of an unintended consequence? It's what happens when you go too fast around a curve, and lo and behold, there is a bridge there that does have a very short guardrail which you can slide right over if you're going 100 miles an hour. Unintended consequences. We use the example and the statements made in the first few verses of the book of Ecclesiastes by that wise man Solomon, who said, I gave my heart to know wisdom. I gave my heart to know madness and folly. I perceived that every bit of it was vexation of spirit. Every bit of it was striving after the wind. Every bit of it was not fulfilling. Did not bring what I really thought it would bring. I sought it in wine and women and song, and there was an emptiness to it. I've used the example before, and I even made mention of this morning of Elvis Presley, and how you can talk about Solomon and Elvis Presley in the same breath. Of course, maybe it shouldn't be the case, but are there not some similarities? Because just as surely as Solomon had everything that he desired at his disposal, did not Elvis too? For sure. And yet, on the backside of a 45 record that I have, and that more famous song is In the Ghetto. On the other side of that 45 is Satisfied Mind. Did Elvis have a satisfied mind? Did Solomon, prior to learning the lessons that he writes about in this book of Ecclesiastes, did he have a satisfied mind? Well, of course not. His life was lived, as it were, chasing after something that he could not ever grab a hold of, like the wind. It was all, in essence, a waste of time. Now, here's the obvious conclusion that we can make from every bit of that. We can know what Solomon did not know, because we're able to look at the beginning of his life, the wisdom with which he asked God, not for great riches, not for a powerful position, but he asked God for wisdom so that he might be able to direct God's people, which were his people. And of course, God blessed him with not only that wisdom, but also with the riches and the honor above anybody that ever lived before or would live after him. But yet, it did not provide him with what he needed the most. Well, we can see that. We can look at the inspired record. We can see the failures in the life of Solomon. And we can, if we want to, we can learn those lessons of history without us having to do the same foolish things that he did to learn them. Do I have to have 700 wives and 300 concubines to realize that a wife can drag you into false religion? No. As a matter of fact, I don't even have to have one. All I got to do is see the example of Solomon and a whole lot of other people too. Right? You see, we don't have to experience that. Do I have to do as Solomon did and plant orchards and have vineyards that, excelled anything anybody could possibly imagine? Had the finest fruit brought in from most extravagant places growing right there in the city of Jerusalem. Do I have to have all those things to realize that's not where it's at? No, we don't have to do that. I eat some pretty good apples, pretty good tangerines, tangelos. But I don't have to experience everything that Solomon experienced to learn the lessons that we have from the record of his mistakes. We can learn that. Is it not the case that many parents hope and work towards the end that their kids do not make the same foolish decisions that they made? Why is that? Because they don't want them to experience it. Is it because they want to keep them from enjoying life like we enjoy? That's not it. It's so that they do not have to suffer the consequences that goes along with making those foolish decisions. Here's where we're going to get into some application of this principle. Believe it or not, I know this is hard to believe for many. Believe it or not, there are some people who, when it comes to the worship of the God who created me and created this whole universe and sustains it with His very power, there is attached to that, seemingly of necessity, as some people think, boredom. It's a boring exercise. Well, if indeed it is the case that it is a boring exercise, how do you think that we could help our brethren who are so bored to overcome that boredom? How do you think that we could help people who simply cannot get excited about, worshiping and serving a God who blesses them with everything that they need and gave His Son to die so that we don't have... For people like that, what can we do to help a person like that? And all the while keeping in the back of our mind this law of unintended consequences. Because if we're not careful, it'll sneak up on us and bite us. If we're not careful, it will. I want you to consider for a few minutes a man, and some of you may not even know who this man is. His name is Pat Boone. Pat Boone was raised, quote unquote, in the church. Parents, members of the church, brothers and sisters, members of the Lord's church. He himself, raised as a Christian, going to Christian university, and he has a great ability to sing. And along with the singing and his charming wit and good looks got him into the Hollywood crowd as well. And so he began to not only sing and make money through the selling of his records, but he also began to be in motion pictures as an actor and made a whole bunch of movies. And everything was going along pretty good for a while. I remember when I was young, before he went off, and he did, and we'll talk about that here in a minute, but I remember that there were some of those movies that he made in which he was the leading man or close to it, which meant there was a leading lady. And it never was his actual wife. And I remember older members of the Lord's church that I'd hear discussing this, and I'm just a kid when I'm hearing this, of course, but they'd say, you better be careful because you cannot even play like you're married to somebody on the screen and kiss them without it end up causing consequences later on you're not prepared for. Maybe some of that law of unintended consequences. Reckon? And so that was a step in the wrong direction. Even as a kid, I could sort of see that's a possibility. Even if you're just in a play, if you're kissing somebody else and it's not your wife, then that might not be a good thing to do. But that's not where he went off. He had the opportunity to take a role in a movie, full-length motion picture called The Cross and the Switchblade. And in that movie, he played a Pentecostal preacher who went onto the streets of New York City and became deeply involved in the gang culture of New York City. Now, this was, of course, something that was new to most people in the South. We didn't understand all about the gangs up north and the gang warfare and the cutting and the shooting and all that went along with that. And so this was an eye-opening experience, just be aware of that by so many. And when I was a freshman in high school, it was a class trip that we went and saw the movie, The Cross and the Switchblade, over at Chattanooga at a movie house somewhere. And in that movie, playing that Pentecostal preacher, he had to learn the role better, he had to rub elbows with David Wilkerson on a daily basis to learn more about it. And lo and behold, you see, as he was raised at Madison Church of Christ, they didn't speak in tongues. They didn't have any divine healing services, anything like that. And so all this that he was being exposed to on the movie set and talking to this Pentecostal preacher was something that was new to him. And when he saw how that this fella could actually go into the middle of these gangs, risking life and limb. I mean, some of those guys cut your head off just to spite your face. Then it made an impression on him to the extent that he started working at getting Pentecostal too. To the extent that he and his family went right in the middle of Pentecostalism. Well, his way in, he began to explain himself. And a whole lot of it, well, you'll see, as I've got some quotations from his book that is entitled A New Song. In that book, he said, church services seem completely out of context with the world we live in the other 6 days of the week. That's another way of saying church services doesn't have anything to do with me at school tomorrow, me at work tomorrow, me on the job tomorrow. Church don't have anything to do with that. It's like it's disconnected from reality. Here's church, and then here's the rest of the world. Where is the disconnect? Now, folks, he didn't say this when he was a teenager last week. He's talking as a grown man back in the mid-60s. So this problem didn't just happen. You know, young people today and some old people are bored silly. That didn't just happen because I'm done preaching. I mean, that was happening before I was even born. People was getting bored. Maybe they were just as bored preachers as I was back then. I don't know. And then another statement. Sure, we'd go to church, but my children would have to punch me to keep me awake. Been there? Done that? Reckon he'd been burning maybe a little bit too much midnight oil kissing somebody else's wife on Saturday when he should have been getting into bed a little bit earlier so he wouldn't have been wore completely out on Sunday, that he would go to sleep when there was a lull in the action? Reckon there's any responsibility on the part of somebody like the worshiper? Or is the responsibility all upon the person who happens to be at the front of the building? When we sit down in a church service, we know somebody is going to preach a sermon. We know we're going to sing some songs we've sung many times before. We've done this so many years that we can predict what the next move will be without even opening our eyes. And folks, if this is starting to sound like something that you could write, I am so glad I'm preaching this sermon. If this could very well be penned by people that you know and maybe even know closely, this is the sermon that you need to hear. And this is the last quotation that I've got out of his book. He had many friends who said, I just don't get anything out of church. I don't get anything out of church. Have you ever known anybody like that? Have you ever known anybody that was almost impossible to entice them to come to services because their attitude was, well, you know, really, I just don't get anything out of church? Well, that's the way it was with old Pat. And with his whole family that he took into the middle of Pentecostalism, and they are in it till this day. Now, here's what you have to ask when you realize that there are a lot of people who have those same attitudes. Do you try to find the root of the problem, or do you get you a little bitty Band-Aid and put it on the symptom? Which one? Well, I know what a lot of brethren have done. I know what a lot of leadership have done. Instead of dealing with the actual symptom, they've tried to put a Band-Aid on the thing. Instead of dealing with the very problem, they deal with the symptom instead. Which leads to an obvious question, because this has been developing amongst us for decades. What has been the effect of the so-called contemporary worship craze among brethren? All over this country, there are congregations who are having 2 different worship services, especially on Sunday morning. They're having a worship service for the old fuddy-duddies, and then they're having a worship service called a contemporary worship service. And in that old fuddy-duddy type of old people's type worship service, it's the regular old thing that we're used to, you know, singing those same old songs that we sing over and over and over again, praying those same old prayers, reading that same old Bible as we have over and over. But then, that contemporary worship service, that's when we jazz it up a little bit. We sing different songs, and we're not really that concerned as to whether those songs are even scriptural or not. They just got a good beat, and we like to tap our feet to it. Really? And in those contemporary services, you know, you can sort of get away from the fact that men are supposed to have a leadership role in situations like that, and you might even let the women take a leadership role in those settings. And what are you doing? Well, it's a good motivation. You're trying to appeal to those people who are bored silly. And folks, if people are bored silly, sooner or later, they're going to be gone. We can't let people be bored silly. We can't let people be going to sleep. We've got to do something to keep them awake. We've got to provide them with contemporary worship. Contemporary? Well, that means what's fashionable today. Watch television, televangelism, hand waving, dancing in the aisle, holy laughter, swooning in the aisles, walking across the tops of the pews, claiming to be speaking in tongues when you're babbling and not saying a thing. That's contemporary. That's all par for the course. What's the Bible say about that? That's vain worship. When Jesus was talking to that Samaritan woman at Jacob's well, as recorded for us in John chapter 3, beginning at verse 23, he said, "The hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshiper shall worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father seeketh such to worship Him." God's a spirit. They that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and truth. Notice the emphasis that Jesus placed on a particular type of worshiper. It's called a true worshiper. The true worshiper, Jesus identified as a specific type of worshiper. He's the worshiper that worships the Father. He's the worshiper that worships the Father in spirit. He's the worshiper that worships the Father in truth. And folks, that's the only type of worshiper that we have any authority to be. You see, worshipers are a dime a dozen. But it never has been God's desire for people to just be worshipers. He's always demanded and He's always deserved true worshipers. With reverence and respect for the God who created me and gives me the privilege of worshiping Him, I'm going to do what He says for me to do in the way He says do it, and that will be satisfactory for me. If God is pleased with my worship, I really don't care if I don't please anybody else, because I can be just as pleased as Punch with my worship if God is pleased with it. I reckon there's a possibility, an application here of this matter of unintended consequences might come to bear in regards to giving people what they claim to want in a worship setting. I reckon people really realized that when they started this contemporary worship phase that they were going to end up having women leading public prayers when men are present. I reckon they realized they were going to have a bunch of women leading singing. I reckon they realized that. I reckon they realized they were going to start having the Lord's Supper being eaten on Saturday. I reckon they realized that. Well, once the camel's got his nose in the tent, then he can pretty well get the rest of them in there too without much effort at all. The fact of the matter is, he should never allowed his nose to get in the tent to begin with. But that was all in a desire to accommodate somebody that didn't deserve to be accommodated to begin with, and the end result or the consequence was, whoa, let's dig our heels in, but it may be too late for some. Reckon? How do we reach the lost? Some people have decided that the real problem that we need to address is the numbers problem. That's the symptom. Now, we don't want to get at the heart of the problem at all. Don't even talk about that. That's too difficult. That's too demanding. I mean, that's going to require that four-letter word that we hate to hear work. Don't even talk about that. Let's just see if we can work on this symptom of numbers crunching. Reckon we can? Well, let me ask you something. Is there anything lacking in that approach? When you hear Paul saying, as recorded here in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10 and 11, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body according to that which he's done, whether it be good or bad. Knowing therefore the terror of the Lord, we persuade men." For some reason, that simply does not fit into the arrangement that's oftentimes positioned as if it's the only one that regardless of what we do, we have to fill the pews. If we have to tape at an undisclosed place in the building a $50 bill under a pew, and nobody can look under the seat until they get in here, and after the first song, everybody just look under the seat and see if they won a $50 bill. Don't lie, that happens. That happens. And that's just a part of what happens. Folks, a long time ago, it should have become obvious to some that if we have to give people a hamburger to get them to show up for services, somebody down the road might start offering T-bone steaks. How are we going to compete with that? Oh, I know, ribeyes. If we offer ribeyes, then they may offer New York strips for two. And where does it end? Reckon it's a problem that goes all the way back to the heart, and we're simply dealing with a symptom? Well, I guarantee it is. Because the next step, which is obvious and we need to ask about, is, well, as we've been focused upon this numbers deal, what kind of conversions has that brought us? You see, if you're concerned with numbers, then obviously there's some things you simply do not ask. You do not ask. Have you been married before? That might get you in a pickle. They might say yes. And then you're going to have to deal with that. Are they scripturally married? Oh, no. Best thing for us to do is just avoid questions like that. Why? Because we're not really concerned with actual conversions anyhow. We're concerned with numbers. And if people would be honest, they'd say that. But you can't always depend upon people to be honest, can you? How do we deal with problems within a congregation? How do we deal in situations in which there may be actual division that results? How do we deal with that? And under the heading of these unrealized consequences, how do we deal with it? Well, think about it. Here's an example that I just read here, probably about a month ago now. Here's the solution of a leader in the sectarian world. This guy is a bishop in the Episcopal Church. Listen to it. Heresy is better than schism or schism. It's both accurate word pronunciations. I like schism better. Heresy is better than schism. Heresy is better than division. Who said that? Well, this bishop did. And he did it because he was chiding gently, this article said, those church conservatives of all things who were imperiling the unity of the country's largest diocese over the consecration of the denomination's first homosexual bishop last November. Boy, that's a long sentence. You know what is he saying? As he's chiding conservative members who frowned upon the consecration of and the providing with the papers and orders from headquarters to go ahead and be a homosexual bishop all at the same time, he was chiding those conservative folks that said, that's not right. If you make a choice between heresy and schism, always choose heresy, said the Right Reverend Peter J. Lee to 500 Episcopalians meeting for the annual Diocesan Council at the Hyatt Regency in Reston. What is he saying? If you've got a choice now between division and heresy, hug the heresy. Whatever you do, don't divide. Now let's see. Now that's what this Right Reverend said. Has Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Peter, Paul, James, and Jude said anything about it, reckon? I dare say that they have. What is the consequence of heresy anyhow? Galatians chapter 5, verse 19 through 21, you'll notice that in a list of sins that Paul refers to by inspiration as the works of the flesh, One of those works of the flesh is, you guessed it, heresy. And what about those who are guilty of these sins, one of them being heresy? They shall not inherit the kingdom of heaven. Now wait a minute. You mean to tell me that here is a bishop in the Episcopal Church who's saying that you ought to go ahead and miss out on heaven so that you can be united with your brethren? If that's not what he's saying, then I'd like to know what he's saying. Or maybe he doesn't realize that the Bible has actually addressed the matter of heresy and placed it in the confines of a work of the flesh. I don't know. Maybe he needs to learn. How do we build faith in our children? Be careful now. Those unintended consequences might come our way. Proverbs 22 verse 6, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he'll not depart from it. Isn't there an easier way? Can't we sidestep that a little bit? You know, that doesn't always work. Well, the wise man Solomon, as he wrote by inspiration, thought that this was a pretty good principle that parents need to use in directing the affairs of their children. Did God want Israel to avoid ridicule? Now that's the reason for the quotation, the section of Scripture from the book of Genesis. Friends and brethren, as was read for us a few moments ago, not only did God want Israel to avoid ridicule, He counted on the fact that they would be ridiculed. He knew they would be. And He knew that the land of Goshen was going to be a wonderful place for that small band of people to turn into the nation of Israel. Because in reality, according to those superstitious and highly idolatrous Egyptians, a shepherd was very, very low in the totem pole. Remember at the end of the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said, beginning at verse 11, Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my name's sake. What? Yeah. Rejoice. Be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. Ridicule? Folks, that goes along with the territory. They did not crucify Jesus for saying, consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They crucified Jesus for saying, thou hypocrite, you whited sepulchres, you children of snakes, how can you escape the damnation of hell? How do we deal with fellowship? Some people say, well, the best way that we can deal with the matter of fellowship is we need to have a written creed. We need to have some kind of manual or some kind of human catechism. Is that the way to deal with it? And should we seek peace at any price? What did Paul say? Romans chapter 16, verse 17, 18. Now beseech you, brethren, mark them which cause divisions and offenses contrary to the doctrine which you have learned, and avoid them. And then he describes these individuals who would cause offenses and divisions among them. For they that are such serve not our Lord Jesus Christ, but their own belly, and by good works and fair speeches deceive the hearts of the simple. Can we avoid the consequences? You see, it's not a matter of us being able to see all the consequences, because we can't. It is possible for us to look at the consequences that resulted from making foolish decisions, as we can read in our Scripture, but we can also see the wonderful consequences that resulted when people did what God wants them to do. Is it possible then for us to avoid some consequences? Absolutely yes. Not only can we should. But we can only do that when we seek the wisdom that God has given that will direct us around, over, under, And in many ways to avoid the pitfalls that are obviously a part of living here upon this earth. Romans chapter 8, verse 28, for we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, who are the called according to His purpose. As Jesus said in Matthew chapter 11 at verse 28, come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. I thought that was just like a invitation verse. Well, it is that. But it's something that applies more than just when I decide to become a child of God. Surely I realize that I can come to the Lord and see His divine guidance on a regular basis and on a daily basis. Because truly that is a yoke that I need to be yoked to for sure. And throughout it all, we need to fight the temptation that will always be there for us to have an attitude of pride. Not many mighty, not many noble, not many wise men after the flesh are called. As a matter of fact, pride is the cause of the turmoil that's faced by far too many people. I honestly believe that pride will cause as many people to be lost as any one sin possible. Here's a person who has believed a certain standard, a certain set of rules, a certain way for his whole life. And then, wham! He sees that's not really the way it is. A dilemma. What am I going to do? Am I going to accept the truth that I now know, being honest? Or do I save face? Do I reject the truth? Do I hang on to my foolish pride? And while I am saving face, I am at the same time losing soul. A lot of people make that choice. We need to make sure that our hearts are not looking down upon other people as if we are the only ones that are thinking. We have to give people a benefit of the doubt until the possibility of there being any doubt is removed. We have to think that there are people right here in this community that are reading our articles, that are listening to our radio and our television programs, who are allowing the truth to find lodging in their hearts. And as we keep on doing what we're going to keep on doing, as long as the Lord blesses us with the ability to do it, then they will respond favorably to heaven's invitation while there's still time and opportunity. That they are thinking themselves and not belittle them for not thinking at all. When we trust in God and we trust in God's wisdom, then guaranteed there are consequences. And those consequences are consequences of blessing. The Hebrew writer said, let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with things that ye have. For he hath said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee, so that we might boldly say, the Lord is my helper, and I will not fear what man shall do to me. Sounds like a pretty good life to live, doesn't it? A life dependent upon God, knowing that if the whole world is turned against me, so what if the Lord is in my corner? Can we avoid the consequences? Will my children be hurt if they take a stand alone? Well, what's faith say? Had we rather they take a stand alone or go along with the crowd to torment? I believe I'd rather them take a stand alone. How about you? Can we avoid consequences? The example that's given here in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 is the Apostle Paul, who 3 times said, please, 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 take this thorn away. 3 times the Lord said, my grace is sufficient. Did you know it's in situations just like that that God does His best work in us? Is when things are rough. And as we look at it, it appears as though there is no escape. There's no way that anything good could come from this. It is at that very point that we are being given an opportunity to grow exceedingly and become all that we can become with God's help and our faithfulness. The question we have to ask ourselves is, are we living in peace with God, or are we living in the blindness of the wisdom that the world offers? And there is a choice. The contrast that James gives us in James chapter 3 is between the wisdom of the world and the wisdom that is from above. The wisdom of this world is sensual, devilish, shows partiality. It's really everything that's bad. While the wisdom that is from above is the opposite of all those things. It's pure, easy to be entreated, and above all, it honors the God who provides for it. How about us, friends? We have been given the privilege of a simple plan that we can understand, that we can know that we understand, that we can obey, and that we can know that we've obeyed it. We can be the beneficiaries of what God offered in His Son, and we can know that we are the beneficiaries of what God offered in His Son. And that's not braggadocio. That's not pride. That's not swelled-headedness. That's simply taking God at His word and acting accordingly. I call that good sense. I mean, we have the good sense to be what God allows us to be. If you're not a Christian, you can be one tonight. If you've wandered away, you can come home tonight. That is the reason we have a song of invitation to invite you to return or to come to make Christ the very central focus of your life from now on. Even right now, while we stand and while we sing.